Welcome everyone to this presentation by the Adirondack Land Trust. My name is Chris. I work here at the Land Trust, and we're delighted to have this presentation on connecting habitat for wildlife across the Adirondacks to Algonquin region. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kate Cleary. Kate is a conservation biologist whose research focuses on evaluating the complex relationships between biodiversity and agriculture. She holds a doctorate in conservation genetics from the University of Idaho, a master's in conservation biology from Colorado State University, and a bachelor's in biology from the University of Richmond. Go Spiders. Between these degrees, she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala, a Fulbright scholar in Costa Rica, and held positions with the National Park Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, and private environmental consulting firms. Kate moved to the North Country in 2017 and is currently an associate professor for environment and sustainability at SUNY Potsdam. So Kate, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for that great introduction. I appreciate that. So I am my day job is associate professor at SUNY Potsdam, but then for 8 years now, I've been also serving on the U.S. side of the Algonquin to Adirondack Collaborative board. So I know that here in our region, a lot of people might call that the Adirondack to Algonquin region. So I'll try and call it that for tonight. But yeah, like Chris said, I am interested in connectivity for wildlife through all kinds of landscapes. And even though, a lot of folks who are interested in the Adirondack Land Trust, probably I assume you're really interested in conservation in the Adirondacks, which is a very important place. But the Adirondacks isn't an island, right? So it's important for animals to be able to travel to our ecosystems and from our ecosystems. And these days, that's not easy. So you can see in this graphic, which is from US Geological Survey, this is the US at night. And some of you may have seen this graphic before, but it's basically, you can clearly see where everywhere is very developed. And we do live in one of the less developed places. You can kind of see we have a little bit of darkness up here still in the Adirondacks, but to get to or from the Adirondacks, animals have to cross through developed areas. And this is even more true in other parts of the country. So, despite all the challenges, I think it always inspires me that animals are really amazing at doing it anyway. So, this is just some cool examples I've run across over the years. So, if you've ever been out west, as Chris said, I did my two of my degrees out west, and one of the things that happens out there is there's animals making long distance migrations, but they will just some things hold them back, but they will really work around a lot of barriers. So here's some pronghorn squeezing underneath barbed wire fence out in Alberta, Canada. And then snow geese on their annual migration they're still using these wetlands that they've used for decades. Even though there's development there, they still find ways to get through. And then out in Seattle, if you've never been there, it's amazing to see the salmon migrating through the locks that they built through the city itself. So, with a little bit of help, animals can still get through these very developed landscapes. So, kind of going back to our region where we are, how connected is our region? So, for me, when I first saw this map, I was like, what's happening? Where am I? Because we're in the south on this map. And I'm always used to seeing us in the north. But in this map, you can see us down here in New York, the Adirondacks down here on the lower left. And this is a map from Staying Connected Initiative, which is one of A2A's partners. And they have done excellent work creating these maps to help us think at a bigger landscape scale. How are animals moving through the landscape? And how can we facilitate that movement? So one of the things you might notice on this map is, hey, where's the Algonquin to Adirondack biological corridor? And it didn't used to be on there because we just hadn't produced the mapping necessary. But that's one of the things I'll tell you about in this presentation that we have achieved since then. So the Algonquin to Adirondack corridor is a really important part of connectivity in our region. And the whole corridor started with the story of Alice the moose. So some of you might have heard of Alice the moose. like full disclosure, that's not a picture of Alice the moose. That's just a picture of a cool mother moose with her two calves. But Alice the moose was a moose who was released in Huntington State Forest as part of SUNY ESF's project to introduce moose back into the Adirondacks. And they released them in 1998, and all of them died. Many of them were hit by cars or they didn't make it through the winter. But Alice lasted a little longer, and they had radio colors on so they could see that Alice, this is her track in red. She made it all the way. She left the Adirondacks. She went up, she crossed the St. Lawrence through the Frontenac Arch or the Thousand Islands region, and she made it all the way up to Algonquin Park up in Ontario. So people were really excited about this. People basically were like, oh my gosh, animals can travel this far between these two really important boreal forest areas. And that inspired people to think about, well, what other animals might be traveling through this region? Is this region worth focusing on as someplace to conserve and protect, just like people work to conserve and protect Algonquin and Adirondack? And so I wasn't around back then I was around on the world, but not on this team, but other people did this work. So people started to think about how animals are moving through this region. And so I'm going to show you a couple of papers that were done, or genetic studies showing, okay, this is clear, incontrovertible evidence that animals are moving north and south. So this is a paper by Jeff Bowman in 2007. And what this showed was, okay, fishers had been extirpated from southern Ontario pretty early on. But then what they used genetic markers to see, they wanted to see like, okay, well, fishers are coming back. Where are they coming from? And what they found using these genetic markers is that if you look at this graphic, the genetic signature of the animals they were sampling in Ontario was partially similar to other animals in Ontario, but it was also had a lot of signature from some older remnant populations in New York State. That means they crossed the St. Lawrence. We don't have video footage of them doing it, but they mixed their genes with the Ontario population, so they're crossing the river. Here's another species that we have evidence that they've crossed the river, so the lynx. And this isn't right down here in our region, but further up on the St. Lawrence River, further towards the mouth, there's evidence. You can see basically if you look at how there's the black dots or the dark gray are Ontario lynx and genetically, and then the light gray dots are southern lynx genetically south of the St. Lawrence. But you can see that there's mixtures. So there's northern Ontario ones showing up south of the river. So they clearly can cross the river. This is evidence of that. And then this is one where they didn't quite cross the river, but it's just basically showing that because of climate change, species ranges are really shifting. And this was a study done in our region on flying squirrels, basically looking at how southern flying squirrels have moved so far north, presumably also crossing the St. Lawrence through the Thousand Islands. They're hybridizing now with northern flying squirrels because their populations are moving north with climate change. So besides this kind of evidence, which is like scientific data that it takes a long time to collect, there's also anecdotal evidence. So there's this one turned out to be real, but of course everyone on this call has definitely heard a story like, I saw a wolf going through my backyard, I saw a mountain lion going through my backyard. Usually not the case, but sometimes it is. So in 2021, some of you may have heard of this wolf who was shot in Cherry Valley, New York. This is the picture that the hunter put on Facebook. So after he put this on Facebook, he was tracked down pretty quickly. And, the DEC was like, that's not a coyote. He said it was a coyote that he had shot. Now, he didn't mean to shoot a wolf. It came up on him from behind and he shot it. He was coyote hunting. So they sent this wolf out for genetic analysis, and it was 98% wolf genes, 2% coyote. So that wolf, they could actually match it back to a Great Lakes origin. So wolves are traveling long distances and they are coming through the Adirondacks. We can't, the DEC will tell you there's not wolves in the Adirondacks. There's not a breeding population, but it certainly is possible for wolves to disperse far enough to get to the Adirondacks. I don't have a mountain lion slide for you today, but we know that mountain lions has also been seen moving through the Adirondacks, and one maybe 10 years ago moved through and then got killed in Connecticut on a road. So these animals are moving. It's definitely the case that animals are moving through this region. So how can we make it easier for them to move through so that as climate change and development continue, we can keep having these populations and maybe even grow these populations. So with that idea in mind, a bunch of people got excited in 2005 to form an organization to protect the Algonquin to Adirondack region, that biological corridor. And so this is our mission statement. We're a US, Canadian, and First Nations partner organization that works with scientists, policymakers, and a variety of conservation groups to protect and enhance the unique ecological features and functions of the A2A region. And our dream is a resilient, ecologically connected A2A region that sustains a full range of native wildlife and enhances people's quality of life for generations to come. So this is a big goal. And, I joined the board in 2018, and I think we've done great work since then, but it is hard for a small organization to try and tackle such a big goal, but we have stuck with it for 20 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work we do to try and make that happen. So because how do you do that? How do you, as a small organization, try and protect an area that's not a protected area? It's not a park. It's not state land. It's a big mix of all different kinds of land that we want to make sure animals can move through. So here's kind of like 4 categories of work we do, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. So we have the A2A trail. So if you're on this call and you love hiking, you could try out this trail next summer. It reaches from Algonquin to Adirondack. You can travel it obviously either way. And this trail basically is like a mix. It's a mixed use trail. So there's like parts that you have to canoe or kayak. There's parts that you hike and there's parts that you bike. And since we started this trail, we've done a lot of work on it, and we now have an interactive trail map with sections that you can download. Like I'm showing you a little screenshot of that here. So I know you might not have, I'm going to show you several QR codes, and I know you might not have time to take a picture of them and use them to follow them to the site, but I'll make sure that, well, Chris and Kim already have a copy of this. So if you want to get to any of these sites, they can share that with you later. But the purpose of the trail is essentially to like keep the idea of Alice the Moose alive, to have people hike this trail and think about how animals move through these landscapes and how that might be hard for them. And we've had several people do through hikes, including one in 2023 that was covered in Adirondack Explorer. So if you ever look up like Algonquin to Adirondacks in Adirondack Explorer, there's several articles on that featuring some members of ADA, including Bill Brown, who I work with a lot. So we do that. Then we have one of our missions is one part of our mission is like bring partners together so that people are thinking not just on the scale of where they work, but on a bigger scale. So we do this biannual science symposium. In 2023, it was in Kingston, Ontario. In 2025, it was in Clayton, New York. And 2027, it'll be back in Kingston. But what we do at these is we bring together people from both sides of the border, scientists, policymakers, government representatives, citizens who are just interested. And we have a full day symposium where people just share work that they've been doing in the A2A region. And we've gotten really great feedback on this event. There's usually about 100 people there. It's not huge, but it's reasonably sized. And the purpose is for people to connect and network and be able to see like, hey, you're doing the Thousand Island Land Trust is doing this work here, and like we're doing this work over here, and maybe we could connect and share resources. because when you work in such a big area, you have to kind of have a patchwork of people working on it. Oh, there's some more pictures from the science symposium. We have a lot of partner organizations. That's me up there with some of my students. I always have students from SUNY Potsdam working on projects related to A to A, and then they come and present. Um, so if you are interested in seeing some of the, we have a lot of, we have about 16 speakers each time in different rooms. So if you, we did record them last time and you can watch them online on our website. You know, if like I did a screenshot of several here, there's some folks speaking specifically on what evidence there is of all animals moving through the A to A region, all the mapping connectivity and detail. So there's lots of talks on there you can check out. Um, we also do a lot of mapping because one thing that I was surprised to find when I was younger and started working in conservation is that all conservation is political. So you think you're going to go away into the woods and study animals and like never have to deal with people again. And it's the opposite of that because you become the voice for the animals, right? So you have to constantly deal with people and convince them that this is important. And so the mapping that we've done at A to A gives us a strong tool to be able to show people visually that we need protection in specific areas. So we've done a lot of mapping projects, like that's ones from 2011, 2014, and then more recently in 23 and 24, and this project's still ongoing. We just received a grant to continue to do some work on this at A2A. So we conducted a more comprehensive, updated mapping of the whole corridor. So you can see it here in this image. That's the cover of the report. But I just wanted to thank our funders who funded that work. The Nature Conservancy, National Park Service, and the Pumpkin Hill Foundation all helped us with this. And basically our goal here was to come up, like, we needed to say, like, what were the ecologically defined barriers of the corridor? And what were the best preserved, where were the paths that animals were likely to travel within there? Because those are the tools that we can use to go to policymakers with. So I did not do this. The Northeast Conservation Service did this with a lot of help from Bill Brown. But we at A2A compiled a wide range of data from the US and Canadian side. So it's not common to have a mapping effort like this be so comprehensive on two sides of an international border. But we got all the data from the corresponding organizations on both sides and then modeled habitat connectivity for four key wildlife groups. So forest generalists, northern boreal, riparian dependent mammals, and turtles. And I know you can't see this well on here, and maybe you're interested in zooming in on an area you're specifically interested in or that you know. And you can do that because, oh yeah, we made this map. We reviewed these results in partner workshops. So we had partner workshop in Clayton in 2024 up at Thousand Islands Land Trust in Clayton, and then one in Maitland, Ontario at 2025. Again, we're bringing in all our partners to look at the maps and say, hey, that doesn't look right, or hey, this area is even more important. And the product of that is our A2A data viewer. So this is a mapping product that is the result of all of that work. And anyone can go on there. It's a work in progress, but anyone can go on there and play around with the layers, look more in depth at where we've predicted with the model that there's high need for protection because many of those four species groups are moving through the area. You can zoom in and look in where are the protected areas on both sides of the border. Where do those overlap with roads? Where do those overlap with wildlife vehicle collision concentration areas? All kinds of data. There's so much data on there. So we really want this to be a tool that partners use to plan how they protect animals in this region. This is a work in progress, so we're still working on it, and the grant that we just got from the Open Space Institute will help with some improving some of this at the parcel level. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you. So I'm kind of giving you like the broad view of all the work that A2A is doing, but I'm going to zoom down a little bit and talk to you about some of the important pieces of it that we've been focusing on for the last few years. So A to A in the past, like basically since I've been on the board, has done a lot of work with road ecology. And if you haven't heard that term, it's investigating the positive and negative effects of roads on ecosystems. Spoiler alert, there's not a lot of positive effects, but there's a lot of negative effects. So um, I'm showing you that lights map again, but now it's also showing the roads. So the roads aren't really lit up like that, but they use GIS to make them lit up. So, boy, if you thought it was hard to get through the urban areas, now look at it with all the roads. Very, very challenging for an animal to move anywhere, really. So, road ecology is like a critical science for connectivity right now in the United States. And the goals of it are not just to like document where wildlife are dying, but to ultimately build overpasses and underpasses to prevent them dying and to give them ways to cross the road. So I put up here like two of the most glamorous ones ever. You may have seen a picture of this if you're interested in crossings at all. That's a famous crossing in Banff National Park in Canada. That's a wildlife bridge. Um, and then out in the Santa Monica Mountains in California, that's not actually a picture. That was a simulation of what it was going to look like. But they did build this. And they also are currently building one out in Colorado. But these are big multi-million dollar projects, but we don't need to just build these. We can build much smaller wildlife overpasses and wildlife underpasses to help animals get across the road. So that's our goal, not necessarily to have one this big, but to have some of these to enhance connectivity for these species. So on the Canadian side of A to A, which if you look at this map here, you can look at the bigger map and you see Algonquin and Adirondack and then the Frontenac Arch link there. So it is kind of like a pinch point that animals have to get through. And so starting back in 2010, Dr. Ryan Danby, who's at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, he and some colleagues started this study to look at like, oh my gosh, okay, if animals can get across the stepping stones of the Thousand Islands, then they're going to have to cross all these highways. So how can they do that? And they worked for several years collecting data on wildlife roadkill on these roads. So basically rode their bikes up and down the highway and documented every dead animal. And with that data, they could see where are more animals dying and where do we need to fix it. And so what you're looking at here is like on the right is like a fact sheet from A to A's eventual right to roam report that we put together from years and years of all of this road ecology work into one fact sheet. And you can find that on our website if you can't read it here. But in a nutshell, Ryan Danby and other folks' studies estimated that about almost 17,000 vertebrates were killed by traffic just between April and October, just on those segments of road every year. So that was then used to that combined with data on like what the landscape looks like and land ownership in that area and where there's parks was used to identify 4 priority locations for overpasses or underpasses, which you can see in this little picture. And I realize now I probably should have made a zoomed in version of that picture, but you can see it on the website exactly where those are recommended to go. So all of those years of data on where wildlife roadkill hotspots were, plus factors related to like the structure of the landscape and land ownership were used to make these recommendations. And it turned out to be very timely because when Ryan Danby and A to A started doing this work in 2010, we didn't know that the Ontario government was going to propose to widen Highway 401, which, if you've ever been up to Canada, as soon as you cross the border in Ogdensburg or Cornwall or Aux Bay, the 401 is the big highway that runs kind of right along the St. Lawrence. So it's a major barrier for wildlife. And the government now is planning to widen it from 4 to 8 lanes. So it turns out that right when they proposed this, we actually had the data to say, hey, at least in this one area, you need to mitigate this, and we can tell you how. And so in the past, I'll tell you more about that later, what you can do. At the end, I'll give you specific things. But we have launched a campaign to basically push the Ontario government to build some of those overpasses or underpasses identified in our studies. And it's going pretty well. Like, we're hopeful about it. So great. Hopefully we'll be successful. Fingers crossed. We'll get them to build some overpasses and underpasses where we recommended. But then what happens when the animals get to the US? So I'm going to share with you just a little bit of, a little bit more info on this study that I did in 2023, 2025, basically saying like, okay, when they get across the river on the stepping stones, then they still need to cross our big highways. And we have fewer on our side up here, at least right by the water, but we do have a few big ones. So we have 12 and 37. You can see them right there in the yellow. So we said, okay, we're going to do a similar study on the other side of the river. And so in 2023 and 24, students from Clarkson University and my students from SUNY Potsdam, we basically rode our bikes up and down those stretches of road and surveyed Route 12 and Route 37 for roadkill in summer 23 and summer 24. So it's actually pretty fun work. It's good exercise. It is sad to see all the animals that get killed. It's truly mind-boggling, like things you wouldn't even think, in that picture. I think that's a short-tailed shrew. Someone can tell me if I'm wrong. It kind of looks like a hairy-tailed mole. I can't tell without zooming into the picture. Anyway, I was really surprised by how many like small mammals would be killed, not even by being run over, but it's by the air pressure change when the trucks go by. So many ways to die on a road if you're an animal. And I'll show you some of the things we found just really briefly along that stretch. So here's Alexandria Bay and here's Ogdensburg. And we basically ran these surveys for 2 years, and this is what we found overall. So 73% of the animals that we found on the roads were frogs. So we found 1,321 frogs dead on the roads. And then mammals is a smaller percentage, 136 mammals, 110 birds, 167 turtles, and 81 snakes. We only did vertebrates, so we didn't do any insects or anything like that. But this data actually fairly well parallels Ryan Danby's research on the northern side of the river in terms of like what animals are being killed more. There's a lot of reptiles and amphibians being killed on the roads. So this is one of our results. Like I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically I put the little wildlife graphics up there to show you. We looked at birds, snakes, frogs, mammals, and turtles, and well, all reptiles, but we just saw turtles. And these are the hotspots. So what does this tell you? We did some statistical analyses looking at where the actually hot spots were that were statistically different from other spots. And it turns out wildlife roadkill isn't evenly distributed along the roads. There are places like these darker colored red places where there's more wildlife killed than on other parts of the road. So this information should be really, we hope, will inform, like, we hope they don't widen 12 and 37 from 2 lanes to 4. But even failing that, we hope to be able to integrate this information into DOT's plans for this region, because in many of those areas, there you can see like there's areas where it's crossing, some of the high mortality areas are crossing a river or a stream. And so there's already culverts going through there, and those could be pretty easily modified without huge expense to improve wildlife passage. So, because I assume everyone, a lot of people on this call came because they like animals, I did want to show you a couple of individual species. So I just picked out some species that were either of special concern or endangered. So that we found there. So we did find wood turtle, which are special concern in New York, endangered in Ontario. Blanding's turtle. So this is one that one of my colleagues, Glenn Johnson at SUNY Potsdam, has done a ton of work with. Um, and they're currently being reviewed for federal endangered species listing in the US, and they're threatened in New York and Ontario. And we did find several Blanding's turtles killed on the road. And then, you would think that not that many birds get killed on the road, but they do. Almost as many birds as mammals get killed on the road. And the only one we found that was of any special concern was the golden winged warbler, which we did find multiple times. So just a couple examples of animals that are having their connectivity interrupted by roads. So just to kind of wrap up, like I was trying to give you a quick idea of some of the projects A2A is doing and some of the things we're finding in the region, but I wanted to spend a couple minutes here at the end with just what you can do to help. Because like I said in the beginning, all conservation is political. So for better or worse, we have to convince people who don't necessarily hold wildlife as a priority that it's an important thing to fund. So one thing you can do is submit a public comment to our Right to Roam campaign. So on the 401 expansion and our idea of proposing the overpasses and underpasses, you can't submit a public comment right now. There's specific public comment open periods. But if you go follow that QR code to the website that we have for this campaign, you will be able to sign up for alerts when there's a open comment. And maybe you're thinking like, well, why would they care what I say? I'm an American. I've had a lot of American friends and me, like I've written in, and I think, I don't know exactly how they rank it, but I do think, knowing that more people care about it helps. But yeah, if you know any Canadian registered voters, tell them for sure. You could also volunteer to represent A2A and educate people at farmers markets or other events. So we have the website and the online ways to help, but we're also going out, not so much like in the winter, but in the summer to table at farmers markets. This is me with my student last year, Emily, to kind of tell people what's happening and tell them about the A2A and that we need to improve wildlife crossings, especially on roads throughout our region. And then for this one, you can also, like I wanted to figure out for everybody, how can you help on the US side of the border? And one of A2A's partners is the Wildlands Network. And they do a lot of, if you're not familiar with them, they do really great work on policy. So following policy for wildlife connectivity and promoting citizen support of that policy and lobbying for that policy to get passed. And there's a bill, the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, that came out several years ago, and so there was funding for it at the federal level in the previous federal administration, and that funding did come through. New York State, one of A2A's folks that we've worked with in the DOT at the state level, worked really hard and got a grant to do an assessment of how to best look for where wildlife crossing should go in New York State. So that funding, though, it hasn't been renewed. So like we got one grant, but New York State got a grant just to assess how we could do this. How can we make it institutionalized in the Department of Transportation to always build wildlife underpasses and overpasses when a road is repaired or built? But this funding was so the Wildlife Crossings pilot program. You can, I know you might not be able to see these down here on this fact sheet, but it was immensely popular. There were there were far more applications from states than there was funding available. And that could be true of a lot of things, but in this case, one of the really interesting things about this bill is that, wait for it, it has bipartisan support. It has two Republican and two Democratic proponents who put this bill forward. And now that is unheard of in this day and age. But I think it shows that wildlife connectivity and wildlife crossings can really unite people across a lot of different political perspectives, because it's like a win-win-win. It's a win for wildlife. It's a win for motorists who don't hit as many animals with their cars. And it's a win for taxpayers because we don't have to pay the taxes for all the repairs and problems caused by wildlife vehicle collisions. So, how do you write to your senator or representatives to say, hey, we want to keep getting this federal funding for wildlife crossings? This QR code will take you to the Wildlands Network site where will give you all the information on who to write to. And I just wanted to thank Misty Booz at the Wildlands Network who put together this information for me for today. And then, yeah, if you were really looking to get up to Canada and check it out, then you could join us at our annual general meeting. It's coming up April 26th in the Elgin Town Hall in Elgin, Ontario. And it is supposed to be, it's the board and then members of A to A who go. So you'd want to join as a member, but you could email this email address here, or just go check out our website and you can see how to join, and you could hear more about all the work we're doing. And in this picture up here, I feel like a lot of people on the call probably know Bill Brown. I think he's on the call, but he's someone from your region, from Keene, who's done so much great work with A-Day, and we hope we'll continue to do great work with A-Day. So that was all I had for you tonight. I think I'm right on time. And there's another QR code if you want to learn more about A-to-A. That's our website. And then if you just want to email me about something, that's my email right there. And I am at SUNY Potsdam when I'm not working with A-to-A.
Fantastic. Kate, thank you so much. And not surprisingly, we did get a number of questions. So we'll just dive right in. You get a sip of water there.
Yeah.
There were two questions that came in that are touching on the same theme of agriculture, which is interesting given your research interest. And so the question was about how much farmland are we talking about in this connectivity area between Algonquin and Adirondack? What are the perspectives of some of the farmers in that area, and what types of practices or things that you see on farms that are either positive or negative towards the connectivity issue for different species?
Yeah, that is a really important question for this region. And I took us back to this map because one of the things we see in the corridors, like the regions in Ontario, southern Ontario and northern New York, right around the St. Lawrence River, are heavily farmed. Yeah. And it's a little different though, because like on the US side, there are some big dairies, but as you all probably know, there's a lot of small farms as well. Whereas on the Ontario side, there's definitely a lot of that's their southernmost farming land, right? So they have their big industrial scale farms there. So on the US side, there are, just speaking pretty broadly, like because there's a lot more small farmers than there are in southern Ontario, there's already a lot of conservation friendly practices happening. Farmers on this side of the border have the soil and water conservation districts where they can go and ask for help to, for example, get a grant to plant more vegetation along streams to avoid erosion. And that type of work also helps wildlife passage because a lot of wildlife move along riparian areas. So if I would say if a farmer was in that area and wanted to know what to do to increase wildlife connectivity, the soil and water conservation districts, which are in each county, have not only great recommendations, but also they'll help you apply for grants to get the money to do that. So on the Ontario side, a lot of the farms are bigger because, like I said, like that's their biggest farming area. It's the southernmost part of their country. So those farms, industrial farms, it's harder. I worked with a lot of industrial farms previous to coming to this area, and they will do it. They will preserve habitat corridors if legislation tells them to. And I'm not just saying Ontario industrial farms, like any industrial farm. So in that case, you need legislation saying, for example, where I did my research in Costa Rica, there was legislation that said like you couldn't cut down trees within 200 meters of a stream. And well, we were trying to get them to pass legislation saying you needed a certain amount of habitat protected in each uh, 10-hectare plot. So I guess I would say in Ontario, it seems a bit top down, and here it's pretty bottom up.
Gotcha. It's, the in the farmland conservation work that we do at the Land Trust, particularly when they abut streams and rivers, getting good riparian buffers for both water quality protection and for that, like you said, the riparian corridors are really important for wildlife movement. Try to get all those conservation values out of that same initiative. You had talked a little bit about ways to volunteer and get involved. I have a specific question here about a retired engineer who has experience with doing field data collection in the field. So, do you have opportunities for folks with a little more interest in getting out like that?
Yeah, I would say definitely send an email to me or to that ATA communications address, because one thing that comes up, you know, we are going to be doing so. Engineers is one of that. Sorry, I get excited when I hear an engineer because we need to pull more engineers into this work, because what we see at like the science symposium and these different events is that engineers are the group that are missing. And we did work with engineers at Clarkson, like when we did the road ecology work. The students who we were coming out with us were all engineering students. So we got that interesting perspective. But um, I think a specific volunteering opportunity that might be available for that individual would be, we're hoping to do more assessments of passability of the culverts and bridges in our region. They're like called North Atlantic, oh boy, NAC surveys. I'm just going to say the acronym NAC surveys. And that is a really interesting marriage between engineering and conservation, where you look at the engineered aspects of the infrastructure and see how that relates to wildlife passage. And we're hoping to do some more of that this summer. So if that person wanted to come out and help with that, that could be amazing.
Cool.
So
I
yeah,
have a
just
question
just
here.
email me, I guess, if they manage to write down my email. Otherwise, you guys can share it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, and maybe Kimberly, if you can put it in the chat too, man, it's another way to get it out there. There's a question. You looked at some of the hot spots on crossing roads on both sides of the river, but when it comes to the St. Lawrence itself, are there hot spots of crossing the river, or is it random, or do we not have that data yet?
Someone might have that data, but I don't. But like basically, I think a really cool study could be done by going on Facebook and mining with AI or something for like all the pictures that people take when they're like in their houses on the river, and they're like, look at these deer on the ice. Look at
Yeah.
these coyotes on the ice, because I see a lot of those. Like I see people posting those. And so I think you could do I think you could do some interesting work looking at like random people's pictures of animals crossing the ice, but it would probably be biased by like where people's houses are. Um, and we do have some data from Thousand Islands National Park, right? So Canadian park. So because they are right smack in the middle of the Thousand Islands, they do have data on like collared deer that have moved back and forth, and they're a great partner with ATA, and so we're able to talk with them a lot about those things. They're definitely deer are moving back and forth through Thousand Islands National Park, but I know there was one study happening a couple of years ago trying to look at genetic data from gray rat snakes to see if they were moving back and forth.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if that's done yet, but we don't have a ton of data. And like the reason's political because try getting a permit to collect genetic data in Ontario and New York. I mean, it will take 2 years. Um, and then you'd also have to get funding to do it on both sides. It's challenging.
Gotcha. Um, you had mentioned overpasses and also upgrading culverts and underpasses. Um, there's a question here about whether one is more beneficial or more functional than another for wildlife.
Yeah, I should have put up more pictures of the options there. They work differently for different species. So, like those cool ones I showed you guys of Banff and everything, a turtle is not going to go over there. It's there's species that are much better at traveling across big bridges like those, like larger species, carnivores for sure. But then the underpasses, very big underpasses will work for large ungulates too, like moose or deer, but even really small ones that aren't that expensive will can work for things like turtles, amphibians, like other animals that aren't going to go across the bridge like that, except really by accident. But one cool video I can point people to is um, the Nature Conservancy did a project in Tug Hill where they installed something called critter shells. And maybe you guys have heard of those, where it's a super relatively inexpensive installation where they basically like in an existing culvert put a metal shelf and like solder it to the side, and then animals can just cross on that shelf. Animals that wouldn't at all cross through like a slippery circular tube that's sometimes wet will go across that shelf happily. And they have camera data to show that. So that's a really good option. You don't have to build one of these awesome overpasses. You can just modify existing infrastructure at a way lower price point.
Cool. So question here about, with this data about, areas that we know have high animal mortality for crossings and things like that. Any thoughts about, or has it ever been discussed, since a lot of us use Waze or Google Maps or things like that to navigate, to integrate high probabilities of collision areas into those mapping programs?
I don't know, but that's such an interesting idea because like we only have data for that small area, but if you visit our A to A map viewer, you can see the data. The Department of Transportation has wildlife vehicle collision data for the whole state. And most states do, right? So if it was reported to the police as a collision for insurance purposes, they have that data. So that's a really cool idea. You should make an app and make $1 million.
Question about bears, and there's been attention over the last, I would say several decades about more bear encounters and bears coming into communities and things like that. And just any thoughts on that issue?
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't think bears need the A to A to maintain their population in the Adirondacks or anywhere around. It's a pretty robust population of black bears in the region, and um, they seem to be a species that, while they, prefer to be in the forest, like I've seen them walking down the street in Canton, New York, and they're almost every year they're seen on like one of the campuses here. Like they are I don't know all the research science about exactly their preferred paths, but they do seem more adaptable than other species to at least moving through human modified landscapes to get to other places. So I don't think they need the corridor to maintain their populations. They're doing pretty well.
Gotcha. So we have 5 minutes left. We can get a few more questions in here. Question about Alice. Did Alice ever migrate back to the Adirondacks? And on a broader note, do you see migrations in both directions, or do species tend to stay in certain areas?
Oh, I hate to end it on a sad note.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, everyone dies. but Alice died in Canada. So yeah, she went, so it's not that sad. I mean, it was her ultimate fate anyway, I guess it was going to be. So where's that side with her? So she did not come back to the Adirondack Park. So it didn't seem to be like a seasonal migration or something that she was going to do over and over. She stayed up there. So um are there, so then to answer the other part of it, is there evidence of animals migrating south? I mean, yeah, like some of these studies, so this study shows animals moving north. This one shows them moving south, as well as north, just both ways across the river. And you can see that because there's like both colors of dots on both sides of the river. So this one shows them moving north. I think it definitely depends on the species and the habitat availability on both sides of the border. A is currently working with a Canadian biologist who's doing a habitat suitability analysis for wolves of the A region. And basically, we just had like an update meeting with him, and he's working with Canadian Wildlife Service to do their whole habitat suitability for the whole country. But he did it for A, and it was basically like there's not a lot of wolf habitat in this region. So for some of the animals, they might not even come south unless we improve habitat here.
Gotcha. A question about some of the other implications of connectivity and about the movement of pathogens and invasive species and what challenges they may present.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are some things about connectivity are negative. One of my other studies I do is actually I do some studies on tick-borne disease and mosquito-borne disease. And so it's like, oh, maybe we don't want connectivity because these things are moving north, these things that have a negative impact on human and animal health. But I think my argument to that would just be, if those things are going to move whether or not there's connectivity because humans move so much. So even if we have a parking lot between here and Algonquin, some human will drive across it with a disease or a tick or something and move the diseases anyway. So um, I'm not an epidemiologist, but my impression is diseases move because humans are really good at moving them, and having connectivity for wildlife might increase it a little bit, but not to the extent that humans are already doing it anyway.
Gotcha. Um, there's a question here about predators. Do predators use wildlife crossings for hunting?
Oh, I'm smiling because I remember somebody asked this question, not of me, but of a carnivore expert, and at a talk that I was at. And basically, their answer was like, yes, there's some, like, some animals might learn to like sit at that one side of the culvert and hunt there. But I, I would have to look that up. They had some kind of answer that was like, it's really not large compared to the number of animals killed on the road.
Mhm.
Um, but so in other words, like the number of increased deaths caused by potentially a predator waiting there is far smaller than the number of deaths by the animals getting hit by cars.
Gotcha. And one last question here, and someone's looking, where can they find this data viewer on the A2A website?
It's not on the A website. You just have to Google A data viewer.
Simple enough. Kate, thank you again um, for this incredible presentation and teaching us a little bit about how the Adirondacks is connected to larger landscapes. For everyone else joining us, thank you for your great questions and participating. And please check out our website, AdirondackLandTrust.org. We don't have a data viewer, but we do have a good events page about different things going on around the park this year, including we have a great ski going over in the Black River Valley, not far from this area, on this Saturday. So hopefully you can join us there. So thank you, Kate. Thank you all, and have a good evening.